snake that ensures the family enjoys wealth, power, and beauty? Could the family have known that this snake was not normal, but emerged from the deepest caves of hell? Was it a conscious choice by the family to worship this snake? What sacrifices does this snake demand in exchange for wealth, power, and beauty? And what price will this family pay to maintain their power, wealth, and beauty? Did the entire family know about this snake? Or was it only one person wielding the devilish powers of this serpent to control the entire family? This is the story of Shantifa, who found herself in a devilish in-law family. Enjoy the tale, and don't forget to hit the like button. My name is Shantifa, and as befitting a devout Hindu girl, I was married at the age of 18 to my husband, Sunil. At the time of our marriage, Sunil was 27, and as is customary in my culture, I was betrothed to him. This arrangement was facilitated by the fact that Sunil's father was a wealthy businessman, and my father worked in his company. I come from a middle-class family with 2 sisters and 1 brother, all of whom were already married and living independently. I, therefore, found myself as the youngest in the household, ready to embark on my own married life. While my brother had chosen his wife, the husbands of my sisters were chosen by my parents. This decision wasn't made under duress. We all believed that our parents knew better. The wedding between Sunil and me was grandly celebrated, with both families in attendance, creating a perfect atmosphere. I felt content with my parents' choice because Sunil was handsome, with a muscular physique and height that I found attractive. I spent days wondering why someone as young, affluent, and good-looking as Sunil had agreed to marry a simple girl like me. The wedding was beautiful, but as this story doesn't focus on the marriage, I won't delve into too many details. We had a wonderful day, and both families thoroughly enjoyed themselves. After the wedding, the troubles with my mother-in-law began immediately. Being young, I was excited about embarking on our tropical honeymoon, but my mother-in-law couldn't leave my husband in peace. She constantly called him, incessantly. As we sat down for meals, she called. As we went to bed, she called again. It was a mystery to me what they had to discuss, but I accepted it as a dutiful wife should. What struck me was that she never inquired about me, nor did she ever send her regards. Normally, one would expect a new mother-in-law to ask about your well-being, but she never did. She sometimes spoke on the phone for hours during our honeymoon, and I couldn't find any interesting topics in their conversations. It appears she called just to keep him on the line. Despite all this, I had a good time. My husband bought everything for me, and I wasn't accustomed to such pampering. Sunil came from a wealthy family, and his parents were in the process of building a house for us. Since it would take some time to complete, we would temporarily move in with his parents. Upon arrival, I was amazed by the house. 7 bedrooms and everything grand in scale. Sunil's parents had only sons. Rohit, Joey, Derek, and Patrick were their names, with Sunil being the middle child. The 2 older brothers, Derek and Patrick, had moved out, and the younger ones still lived at home. I was pleased to be the woman of the house, ready to assist my mother-in-law in every way, like a true daughter should. My father-in-law had been kind from the start, giving me compliments and engaging in friendly conversations. My mother-in-law, however, was different. From the beginning, she was curt and unfriendly, with a disdainful look, often scanning me from head to toe, as if she wanted to say many nasty things, but chose not to voice them aloud. Whenever I offered to help, she would respond sharply, "Not necessary. We have staff for that." I made endless efforts to win her favor, but she continued to push me away. I noticed that Sunil's brothers seldom visited, and his mother wasn't constantly on the phone with them. I asked Sunil about it, but he was very protective of his mother. You weren't allowed to say anything negative about her, or he would snap at you. It turns out, he had been a troubled child in the past, and his mother wanted to keep him close to prevent him from returning to his old ways. Black horror stories community, this was not the truth. His mother needed him close for her demonic rituals, but I'll tell you more about that later. I observed my mother-in-law becoming increasingly unpleasant towards me. She made it clear she was not fond of me, speaking negatively about me to my husband and other family members. As a result, my relationship with my husband's family became strained, and I was no longer invited to family events. It got so bad that my parents were invited while I was not. To avoid causing a rift, I lied to my parents, telling them I couldn't attend due to illness or work, even though I was alone in the vast house. I didn't want my parents to realize the difficult situation I was in. Meanwhile, I had been living in the house for over 6 months, and the situation was not improving. Once, while alone in the house when the rest of the family was at a family gathering, I suddenly heard banging noises on the top floor. I could hear people talking, but couldn't make out what they were saying. I thought it might be burglars, but I couldn't understand how that could be possible. The house had 3 security guards, and one couldn't simply access the family's floor. You had to pass the guards, a large gate, and then walk a considerable distance to reach the front door. How did they get all the way up? I was terrified, but decided to sneak to the front door and then run to the security guards. The guards were in their usual positions, and I shouted that there were burglars in the house. I had to wait at the gate, and once inside, they thoroughly searched the house. It took a while, but they returned, saying they found nothing. The house was empty, and there were no signs of a break-in. Everything seemed fine, and they suggested it might have been my imagination. For every incident, my father-in-law had to be informed, so as expected, the family hurried back home. I stood at the door as they stepped out of the car, and my malicious mother-in-law threw me a deadly look, as if to say I had ruined their evening. I noticed her striking red lipstick, which she always wore, and she bit her lips. From experience, I knew she only did this when she was furious. While my father-in-law engaged in a conversation with the security guard, my mother-in-law continued to give me a chilling stare, as if I were just a piece of dirt. I know it may sound strange, but I admired her and kept thinking, how beautiful she is. Despite my constant fear when she was around, I secretly admired her beauty. I always saw how everyone, regardless of age or gender, was impressed. Everywhere she went, there were admiring glances. She also looked extremely young for her age. Well, people, I couldn't explain what I had heard, but it was very clear that the sounds were coming from upstairs in the house. I wasn't crazy. There were voices audible, and you could tell it was bustling upstairs. However, there was no sign of forced entry, and nothing seemed to be broken into. So, my husband insisted that I must have heard wrong. Since that day, my mother-in-law became even ruder to me. She completely ignored me, and when she spoke, it was in a disrespectful tone. She told the outside world that I was disturbed, that I urgently needed help from a psychiatrist, and it hurt me. This was because my in-laws were respected in our society. So what effect would such statements have on my future? She never hesitated to call me stupid, claim that I lived in my own world, was half crazy, and never in a clear state of mind. In short, according to her, I was just a crazy person, and she always added that she couldn't understand why her son chose someone like me. According to her, he could have found someone much better. This was all nonsense, of course, because I didn't find their son. I was arranged to marry him. I felt so low due to the treatment of this mean woman. She made me doubt myself. I started to lose my sense of self, unsure if I was good enough and worthy of being with her son. She came up with the most degrading things to torment me. The family had multiple employees in the house, and there was one lady I was particularly fond of. Her name was Margaret, and she was an excellent cook. Whenever I had nothing to eat, she would secretly call me to the kitchen, where she would cook delicious meals for me, and we would have extensive conversations. One afternoon, Margaret was busy in the kitchen. I entered and asked why she was cooking so much. There was another family event for which I wasn't invited, and I knew no one would be home. Margaret looked at me alarmed and said it was time for me to see something. I had to promise not to tell anyone what I would see, and I gave her my word. After hours of cooking, Margaret placed the food in beautiful dishes, and I noticed she made an extra effort to arrange everything neatly. When she finished, she called me and asked if I could help her take the food away. I thought we would go outside, but instead, we walked to the top floor of the house. As mentioned before, the house of my in-laws was incredibly large. Once upstairs, we walked quite a distance to a place in the house I had never been. At the end of the hallway was a large golden door, and I was astonished by its beauty. Margaret opened this door, revealing another corridor leading to another door. It looked beautiful. The floor was made of marble, and the ceiling was made of glass, allowing the sunlight to shine in beautifully. We stopped at another door, which appeared to be made of copper, as it looked very heavy. The door was beautiful, with a magnificent snake depicted on it. Somewhere, I found this frightening, but the door was very elegant. Before Margaret opened the door, she told me that I absolutely must not say anything to anyone, or she would get into trouble. I nodded, and Margaret knocked 3 times on the door before opening it. People, my heart pounded with excitement, because I didn't know what was behind this beautiful door. Once inside, it was dark, and I looked around, but it was very dark. The room smelled of incense, and there was a large smoke cloud in the room. In the corner of the room was a large golden altar with dolls, black candles, and an abundance of money and jewelry on and around the altar. I don't know what it was, but I didn't feel good in the room. It felt like I was tripping. I seemed to be under the influence of drugs, but that wasn't the case. I felt lightheaded, and I was completely confused by what I saw. The room was full of mirrors, and in the middle of the room was a large and beautiful bed. Margaret asked me to place the food on the enormous bed with her, and I didn't quite understand why we had to do that. As we placed the food on the bed, the room started to move. I was startled, and Margaret grabbed my hand, telling me to stay calm. Something emerged on the bed, but I couldn't see clearly what it was. It was something shiny with a beautiful color. When it moved towards the food, it became visible. It was a gigantic snake moving towards the food on the bed. The head of this creature rose, and out of fear, I took a few steps back. It was as if it sensed my fear and wanted me to see it. The head of this creature was gigantic, and its eyes were fiery red. I can't explain it, but in my head, it seemed as if something was telling me to leave, or I would regret it. Paralyzed with fear, I stood still in the room when I heard something in my head again. This time, the tone was much more aggressive, and I heard, "Get out, Oregon. You will regret it." Yes, this sounds crazy, but I believe that thing was talking to me. The beast turned its head toward Margaret and hissed aggressively. Margaret, stammering, said, "I'm sorry, Your Highness. I should have informed you in advance that she was coming. I'm sorry, Your Highness. I apologize. Please don't harm her. She belongs to this family. She might come to feed you and bring offerings. She won't cause you any trouble, I promise." Eventually, the snake lowered its head, and Margaret ran to take the trays from me and place them on the bed with the snake. Then, she made a sort of bow and pulled me out of the room. Outside the room, I was trembling with fear, and Margaret said she had never experienced this before. Margaret said that she was paid more than her regular salary if she did this once a week, and that my mother-in-law had told her that this creature was her pet. My mother-in-law had taught her exactly what to do, and she went to that dark room every day to offer sacrifices and pray. I immediately knew that this could never be something good. All the candles in that room were black. The room was full of mirrors, smelled strange. It was ice cold, even though the air conditioning was not on. It just didn't feel right. We walked through the corridors until we found ourselves back in the kitchen. The image of that creature continued to haunt my mind. I couldn't believe that something so terrifying lived in this house, and I had been oblivious to it for months. My beautiful mother-in-law worshipped a serpent, and judging by its glowing red eyes, it wasn't an ordinary snake. It was a demon or something dark. No wonder these people had so much wealth. Their businesses thrived continuously, unaffected by the economic crisis our country was facing at the time. While others struggled, my in-laws continued to host lavish parties, embark on expensive foreign trips, acquire new jewelry, and renovate their homes, all without feeling the impact of the economic downturn. I was scared to go to my room, so I turned on as many lights as possible in the house and sat in the living room to watch TV. It was already evening, and I was alone, so I slowly drifted into a deep sleep. In my sleep, I heard someone calling my name. It started faintly, but persisted until it jolted me awake. Opening my eyes, I still heard someone calling my name in the house. I was anxious, looking around the empty living room. I knew something was amiss in this house, and I suspected it had to do with what I had seen. I spent an hour sitting with my knees drawn up, waiting for my husband to return home. When he finally got there, I told him that I kept hearing someone calling me, and it only stopped when I started praying. Yes, folks, I had been praying all the time until my husband came home. Sunil was worried about me. He held me tight again, but he didn't say much. He comforted me, but he didn't respond to what had happened to me. He just said, "Everything will be fine, honey. Don't worry. Here you are safe in this house, And no one can do anything to you. Don't be afraid, honey. I'm here to protect you. He put me to bed, and I fell asleep straight away. Around midnight, I woke up, and Sunil was no longer beside me. Curious, I went to see where he was. When I softly opened the door, I saw my husband and mother-in-law having a heated argument at the bottom of the stairs. They were shouting at each other, their faces revealing anger over something. At a certain moment, I noticed that Sunil moved closer to his mother, and it seemed like he was about to make a striking gesture. At that moment, his mother stepped back, seemingly commanding him to kneel before her. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Sunil dropped to his knees, apologized for his behavior, and then stood back up. My mother-in-law grabbed his face and kissed him on the mouth. I was disgusted. I was raised with manners, and my parents never kissed their children on the mouth. Although it's not uncommon for parents to kiss their children on the mouth in some families, I didn't think much of it at the time. However, as the story unfolds, you will discover why this kiss was not just an ordinary one, and why it was considered normal in this devilish family. Weeks passed without any significant events. Occasionally, I heard a hissing voice calling my name, but I dismissed it as my imagination fueled by what I had seen. One afternoon, while nobody was home, Margaret was again busy in the kitchen. By now, I knew what she was up to, but this time, I chose not to accompany her. She asked if I was afraid, and I admitted that at certain times of the day, I heard something calling my name since the encounter with the serpent. Margaret laughed and said it was normal. The serpent wanted to communicate with me. Startled by her response, I asked her what she meant. She explained that the serpent often communicated with her, delivering messages and specifying what it demanded in terms of food and other offerings before she performed her duties. When I inquired about the nature of these offerings, it became evident that she was reluctant to discuss it, quickly changing the subject. At home, things were not going well for me. I turned into an emotional wreck due to various incidents in the house. I often dreamed that a serpent was trying to strangle me. In my dream, a snake would crawl onto the bed daily, slowly wrapping its body around me. It sounds strange, but as soon as I woke up, it felt like I could smell its scent and feel the warmth of its body on mine. Usually, when I had such a dream, I would wake up with a nosebleed or a bruise near my ear. Every time, I would wake up Sunil, but it seemed to not affect him. He said I was probably affected by the heat in the room, and that I was imagining strange things. I also witnessed strange occurrences on various mirrors in the house, and constantly felt cold gusts of wind passing by me. For instance, after taking a shower, I would see fingerprints and handprints on the mirrors. This was odd, because I always locked the door, and no one could enter the bathroom. It seemed as if multiple people had touched the mirror. I also heard something calling me in the house when no one else was present. Due to what happened with the security guards entering the house and finding no one, I decided not to call out to anyone anymore and to keep quiet about it. On a particular day, when I was feeling unwell in bed, I heard my husband calling my name. Stepping out of the room, I saw my husband turning around the corner. He continued to call me and said he couldn't wait to show me a gift, leading me to the upper floor. I followed him, smiling, expressing curiosity about the gift. At some point, I realized Sunil was heading toward the serpent's room. and I didn't want to go there. Since the encounter, I had been terrified of that creature. But if I showed that I knew what was in there, Margaret would lose her job, as she had confided in me. Sunil walked through the door where the serpent resided, and I heard him calling me again in the room, urging me to hurry because he couldn't wait to show me my gift. My heart pounded in my chest as I gently opened the door, unaware that what I was about to see would change my entire world. But before I continue with that part of the story, I'd like to ask you to press the like button. This helps us grow, reaching more people through our channel. Thank you. My heart raced as I opened the door. I didn't want to see the serpent again, but I knew it would happen once more. People, nothing could have prepared me for what I was about to see. The ground vanished beneath my feet, because when I opened the door, I saw my husband, Sunil, lying on the big bed, and my mother-in-law was naked on top of him. Yes, you are right. They were having sex on this big bed in the company of the snake. Mother and son, how sick is that? I stood there with my mouth wide open, not knowing what I was seeing. It seemed like they didn't realize I was watching, because my mother-in-law moaned loudly with pleasure, and my husband was going at it like an animal. We had never had sex like that. It was intense. I stood there for minutes, and it kept going on until his mother turned her face towards me and continued with a smile. It seemed like she enjoyed that I was watching. It almost seemed like she wanted me to see it. I couldn't take it anymore and ran through the hallway back to my room. Quickly, I grabbed my car keys and stormed out of the door. I drove away from that place, away from these people, away from that cursed house. I didn't know where to go and kept driving around the city for hours. Eventually, I stopped by a river and stayed in the car. Once stopped, I started crying hard. All the frustration, pain, disappointment, and disgust I felt came out all at once. How could Sunil do this to me? Having sex with his mother? How long had this been going on? What kind of filth was this? Did my father-in-law know about it? What would he do if he found out about his wife? I didn't dare go to my parents. What would I tell them? That I had seen my husband fucking his mother? Just beastly, porn-like, dirty sex. It just gave me goosebumps again. And now that I remember this, I feel the disgust bubbling up in me again. I became completely depressed from what I had seen. I decided to drive to Margaret's in the hope that she could calm me down and make me feel better. Once I arrived, Margaret was surprised. She hadn't expected me, but could see that something was wrong. She gave me a glass of water and asked me what was going on. I told Margaret everything because I was done with it. I told her about hearing my name, the footsteps, the fingerprints, the cold wind. Really, I told her everything. I also ended with what I had just seen, catching my husband with my mother-in-law. Margaret looked at me thoughtfully and said, "How did you find out? How did you discover that they were having sex?" I saw her hands trembling as she brought the teacup to her mouth. She seemed shocked by everything she heard. I said that the disgusting creature probably lured me into the room when Margaret quickly covered my mouth with her hand. "Don't talk about that creature like that. I speak from experience. Please don't do it, I beg you." I was shocked by this remark and asked what she meant. Margaret stood up, walked to the window, and said, "I don't know if I should do this, but I will tell you my story. I have experienced so much in that house, and I am permanently connected to it." Margaret told me how she ended up with the family and that my mother-in-law was older than her. I couldn't believe it because my mother-in-law seemed 30 years younger, but it turned out to be true. Margaret explained that she became closer to my mother-in-law, and it was noticeable that everything about my mother-in-law was related to a snake. Her jewelry was in the shape of a snake, and she even had a large mirror in her room with a snake incorporated into it. As an employer, you don't ask about these things, but because she became such good friends with my mother-in-law, she decided one day to ask where the obsession with snakes came from. My mother-in-law quickly laughed and told her that she would show her why that was very quickly. A few days later, Margaret was called by my mother-in-law. She gave her a bowl with a lid and asked her to bring it to the room where the snake is. And she said that Margaret should place the bowl on the bed and then remove the lid. Margaret was still unaware of everything and did as she was asked. Margaret swallowed and continued. I saw nothing in that room. It was an unfamiliar space for me, and it was dark. But as instructed, I placed the bowl on the big bed and removed the golden lid. I will never forget what was underneath. Margaret burst into tears and was completely distraught. What did you see when you removed the lid, Margaret? I asked her. She looked at me with tears in her eyes and said, It was a fetus, a very small one. I don't know how many months or weeks it was, but I could hold it in my hand. It lay there lifeless in that golden bowl, and I didn't know who it belonged to, but I was so frightened that I dropped the bowl with that tiny baby from the bed onto the floor. I then suddenly heard a loud voice speaking to me. The voice was very aggressive, and I immediately got chills down my spine. I can't explain that voice, but it was so scary that I can't explain it other than as something demonic. Margaret said that she ran out of the room out of fear and saw my mother-in-law standing in the hallway. She was so scared that she ran past my mother-in-law, but she could see that she was extremely angry with Margaret. Once out of the house, she ran to her car and drove home. But something terrible awaited her there. Once she arrived in her street, her house was on fire. She was shocked because this was her house, her temple. She had worked for this for years. When the fire brigade had finished putting out the fire, my mother-in-law called her and said that she owed it all to herself. She had shown no respect for her gods, and if she didn't come back soon to apologize, even worse things would happen. Out of fear, Margaret returned to the house where she eventually met the snake. Under the guidance of my mother-in-law, she had to do various rituals to say sorry. And from that moment on, Margaret became the person who had to make the sacrifices for this animal. Now and then, a fetus had to be sacrificed, Margaret indicated. This was not monthly, but at least once a year. It was unclear where the fetuses came from. Margaret also told me that it was not my husband that I had seen in the hallway. That snake deceived you. It was that snake that kept calling you. It took the form of your husband so that you would follow him. That demon wanted you to see what your husband was doing with his mother, she said. Demons feed on people's fear, sadness, and pain. My father-in-law was aware of everything, but said nothing. As Margaret told me, he was also worked through black magic. He did everything his wife asked of him. He had almost no opinion of his own, and was always submissive to her. Slowly, I started to understand why my mother-in-law didn't like me. She saw Sunil as her property. After we had talked for a while, I suddenly felt it getting wet between my legs. When I looked, my clothes were full of blood. A lot of blood. Margaret was shocked and said, "My goodness, not this again." She ran to get towels and told me to take a shower and then lie down on the bed. She had seen this before with other daughters-in-law. I was shocked by this, but took her advice. When I took off my clothes, I saw lots of blobs of dark blood in my underwear, and more blood kept flowing out as I showered. Blocks of blood that looked like liver fell out of my vagina while showering. I didn't think about it too much because I felt so bad and was in way too much pain to think straight. I thought, this is the end of my life. I'm going to die. I felt like I knew too much and that the demonic family was trying to get rid of me. I fell asleep on Margaret's couch shortly after showering and thought I wouldn't wake up. After a few hours of sleep, I woke up and it seemed like nothing had happened. I felt normal, and both the bleeding and the pain suddenly disappeared. This was strange, but Margaret said that this was the work of that beast, and that I was perhaps in the early stages of pregnancy. It had now become clear to me that I would never go back to my in-laws' house, and I didn't want anything to do with them anymore. After some time, I drove to my parents' house, and once there, I told them everything that had happened in recent times. My parents were shocked, and at the same time, very fearful, especially because Sunil's father was my father's boss. Sunil kept calling and texting me as if nothing was wrong. Perhaps he thought I was unaware, or did he truly not know? It was all unclear to me. I continued to ignore his calls, and after days of doing so, he called my parents and pleaded to visit me. They agreed, and shortly after, he was at the door, begging me and wanting me back. He couldn't live without me, and I heard no apologies for the incestuous acts with his mother. I tried to get him to admit it, but he didn't understand what I was talking about. He claimed it wasn't true, but people, I know what I saw. Did his mother take him over with demonic powers, making him do things he didn't want to? Was that it? According to Margaret, that wasn't the case. The children were conditioned to believe such acts were normal from a young age. My mother-in-law had been having sex with them since they were children, so for them, this was nothing strange. It was a satanic ritual to have sex with those boys at such a young age, and my mother-in-law even got pregnant by those boys. That was demonic offspring, which explained the fetuses. My mother-in-law took special substances that caused the fetus to come out spontaneously. At least that's what Margaret told me. And she had seen for herself how my mother-in-law sometimes pushed the child out with pain and cramps. A question that had been on my mind for a long time was also why Sunil's two older brothers no longer visited when my in-laws were home. I later got answers from Lisa, Derek's wife, my sister-in-law. Lisa came to visit me unexpectedly at my mother's house. I let her in, and she said she was glad that I was also free from the devilish house of my in-laws. She had not had a pleasant time there either. My mother-in-law had given her the same treatment as me. However, it went even further with her. Lisa had become pregnant several times, but had a miscarriage every time after 10 to 12 weeks. After each miscarriage, she wasn't allowed to go to the hospital, and my mother-in-law took the fetus and said she would take care of a proper farewell. People, we all now know where those fetuses went. They were sacrificed to that rotten beast. Lisa knew it afterward, but neither of us mentioned it. It would be too painful for her if I brought it up. But we both knew that my mother-in-law had sacrificed the fetuses to her snake. The same snake that possessed my mother-in-law, and the same snake that took over her when she sexually abused her sons. Lisa and I talked for a very long time, and she was glad that we had such a good conversation. I must tell you that I still have many questions in my head. Why did they choose me as the wife of their son? Why? If I was not good enough in that woman's eyes, nothing about me was sufficient for her. Why choose an ordinary girl? Margaret told me that my mother-in-law chose a girl from a poor background, as she called it, because she was planning to sacrifice me. Human sacrifices within the family somehow hold great value, as sacrificing someone from your own family yields much more from the demons. Margaret said she was almost certain that my mother-in-law chose a girl of lesser value because she had no intention of keeping me in the family for long. As she had hinted before, I was supposed to quickly have a few children, and then she would personally ensure that I would be sacrificed. Margaret shared this information with great difficulty because she said that since the fire in her house, she has tried to stay out of this mess with my mother-in-law as much as possible. She knows how cunning and dangerous this woman is. If that wicked woman says something, she does it, Sarita assured me. Once I had a few grandchildren, I would mysteriously disappear. The police would never suspect her or this family because high-ranking officers, inspectors from the police attended family gatherings and were friends with these people. They wouldn't hesitate to protect them if necessary, and no one would suspect them because my in-laws are so influential. I'm grateful to Margaret that through her, I have learned so much, because otherwise, I would have had many more questions. I am glad that the snake showed me what Sunil was doing with his mother. This disgusting, incestuous sex that I witnessed with my own eyes will be a trauma for me for the rest of my life. This woman was truly demonic. Months have passed, and I'm still married to Sunil. He has consistently refused to divorce and refuses to sign the papers. He tells my parents that he will continue to fight for me and that he will eventually get me back. Margaret told me that he and his mother have daily arguments in the house, and he is losing his mind. He has told his mother that if anything happens to me, he will end it, causing her to lose him. I think this statement may be my salvation because his mother needs him for her devilish rituals with that beast. If he hadn't said this, I am afraid that something would have happened to me by now.